Good morning and happy Wednesday. Welcome back. We're on day 3 of our NCA speaker series. Today's seminar is titled Learning the 3 C's, Becoming a Competent Classroom Communicator. My name is Scott Myers. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication Studies at West Virginia University. On Monday, as you recall, we talked about developing a sense of teaching effectiveness. And yesterday we discussed teaching from the student perspective. So as you've had a chance to start to reflect on those two discussions, I hope you're starting to see how this is all going to fit together. As we develop our sense of teaching effectiveness, we have to have an understanding why our students talk to us. Today we're going to talk about teaching from the rhetorical perspective, and this is going to be complementary to tomorrow's topic as well. The idea of teachers teaching from a rhetorical perspective as well as a relational perspective, which is tomorrow's, originally came from a theory proposed by Timothy Mote, Ann Freimeyer, and Steve Beebe, called rhetorical relational goals theory. Or goal theory. Sometimes it's referred to goals or goal, depending on where you're reading it. It originally appeared in the 2006 Handbook of Instructional Communication, which I have listed as one of the resources should you have a greater interest in some of this instructional stuff. But the bottom line here is, from that theory, the idea was born that effective teaching requires teachers to think rhetorically about their students and relationally about the students. And the idea here is that when you're a good teacher, you do so, both rhetorically and relationally. Now, what happens for a lot of us is we're drawn to one of the two because we're either more interested in it or, to be honest, we're better at it. And sometimes these two are viewed as competing discourses or competing perspectives, but they're not. They're complementary. So today, we'll talk about the rhetorical perspective. Tomorrow we'll talk about the relational perspective, and then we'll see how they go together and why these two can really help you develop that sense of teaching effectiveness. Now, the rhetorical perspective is pretty straightforward. The rhetorical perspective basically suggests that instructors need to intentionally and strategically create and deliver their messages, because the purpose of the message is to either influence or persuade students to accept the content. So we consider this perspective, the rhetorical perspective, to be message-centered and teacher-centered. So the idea here is it's all about you as the instructor. Now, obviously, you're going to take your students into account when you create your messages. But the idea here is that you're going to think purposely about what you're going to teach, content-wise, and then you're also then strategically going to engage in the instructional communication behaviors that will allow you to relay this content. So when you look at the instructional literature, there are several behaviors that you could argue are rhetorical in nature or are relational in nature. So we won't get into that debate. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about 3 particular behaviors that we consider to be rhetorically, rhetorical in nature, because you have these under your control. This is what you want to keep in mind here. And we're not talking about the content per se. We know that that's something you have to learn. That's one of those hard skills required of all instructors. We're talking now about the delivery. So anytime you create a lecture or a discussion or even a group activity, and keep in mind, actually, I think that when we talk about these 3 behaviors in a moment, you might be inclined to think of them as only being relevant to the lecture because they lend themselves easily to that. But these 3 can be employed in everything you do in a written or oral format in the classroom. So this would apply to creating your learning objectives. This would apply to your creation of your exams. This would apply to how you create and implement your learning outcomes. Did I already say that? I might have. This also has to do with any discussion prompts you have for your students, or any activities, or any paper assignments. The idea here is that when you design your message for that particular unit, that particular class, that entire semester, whichever, you need to keep three behaviors in mind. And I'm going to talk briefly about each one. And in our readings, there's some actually there are some tables and charts in a couple of these that you can easily access as you're reading the article, as a way to just pinpoint what you may think about doing in the future if you're not doing it already. All right, so the three rhetorical behaviors that most instructional communication researchers tend to focus on are clarity, relevance, and humor. Clarity and humor are widely researched in the instructional communication discipline. Relevance, not as much. And I think that's partially because we haven't decided yet if relevance is really another way of being clear, or is it just an effective teaching outcome? And again, as you read the articles that I've picked for today, that might be a question you can just think about. But the bottom line here is that all these, again, are intentional. And most of us would probably say, well, of course, I always intentionally am clear. I try to be relevant. My humor is intentional. Well, not always. And perhaps for most of us, not as focused as it could be. All right, so let's talk just a little bit about clarity, because this is one of my favorite behaviors, just simply because I really think and that if you're clear, things are going to work out well, even if you're not as relevant as you could be, even if you don't use humor in the classroom. Clarity is going to be so key. We're going to define or operationalize clarity today as the specific oral or written messages instructors utilize in order to enhance student understanding and retention of the course content. If you were to do an extensive research review of clarity, you're going to find there's a lot of definitions out there, and some of them, quite frankly, aren't helpful because they'll use the term to define it. Clarity is being clear in the classroom. That doesn't work, right? We're talking about our intentional creation of messages or our intentional use of behaviors that will allow students to understand what we're saying and retain the course content. That is what clarity's intent is. And that's why I think it's one of the most fundamental instructional communication behaviors that any of us can use. And students themselves will report, and this has been done in a few of the articles that you'll read or get, the clarity emerges consistently, as a predictor of learning. It's also the behavior students want the most. So if there's any behavior from today or tomorrow that you should implement in the classroom, it is clarity. Now, clarity can take a lot of different forms, so we don't necessarily spend too much time on that, and that's part of the problem when defining it. So, we know clarity can be oral and written. So again, I think a lot of us focus on the oral part. We're assuming, it's us talking to the student. But remember, all your written documents have to be clear as well, and that's sometimes where students have a hang-up. One document we overlook oftentimes is our syllabus. Making sure that everything is crystal clear in that syllabus, and then also making sure that how we talk about it or what we talk about in class mirrors the syllabus. So that's probably one of the most important documents as well. And students will peruse that for clarity, especially when it comes to a policy. Because course policies and course procedures are two of the things that students want to know from day one. And we all vary in terms of the amount of information we give in our syllabi on all of those things. We also know that clarity has a content and a process component, which we don't necessarily think about as well either. We focus more so on the content, right? The content, how we deliver it, whether we're using particular mechanisms, like highlights or signposting or illustrators as part of the clarity. whether we write on the board or use a PowerPoint. Those are all content elements of clarity. The process refers more to how we explain things to students outside of content. How do we explain assignments to students? I'm sure we've all been in a spot where we get irritated and students asking question after question. We say, oh, just read it. It's in the syllabus, or it's in the sheet I gave you. All right, not the best answer, and we know that too, right? But that's part of clarity. How do we explain our assignments? How do we provide feedback to students? When you're giving them their feedback. How do you help students prepare for exams? Things like that. So that's the process element of clarity that we sometimes overlook. Other things that we may not think about, is what we might call, our disfluency or our fluency, whichever term you want to use. How do we articulate? How well is our articulation? Is it hampered by, chewing gum or drinking or something like that while you're speaking? Let's see, information overload, giving too much information, which goes along with just, fluencies, are we speaking too fast? The coherence, staying on topic. Some of us are great as we can go in and we go from point A to point B and it's perfectly timed. Other instructors go off on tangents or get distracted by student questions. So that's part of clarity as well. Just our general organization. This is one reason I think a lot of us like PowerPoint, because it helps us organize and stay it helps enhance our clarity in that way. Obviously, there's, PowerPoint also has its downside when you're teaching, particularly from the relational perspective. So we'll, mention that maybe tomorrow. So the bottom line here is when we think about clarity, there are a lot of different ways in which we can think about it. Now, in the readings I have for today, there's one by Joe Chesbrough. It's a convention paper from 1999. And the reason I'm asking y'all to look that over is because he has a figure in there, which I'm going to read a little bit off of it, but not too much because you can go back and refer to it, where he develops what he calls the profile of the clear teacher. And in this particular piece, he says that a good teacher, the profile of the clear teacher, not a good teacher, sorry, the clear teacher is both structurally and verbally fluent. And we know that that can be difficult to be verbally fluent constantly, especially when you're talking extemporaneously or you're trying not to talk from a script. And students do forgive that stuff. If it's minimal, it's only when it becomes excessive. All right, so verbally clear instructors, for instance, he says, do not overuse terms such as We all know that. Probably all of us have something in our vocabulary that we get stuck on. Some people, the word like, the phrase such as, and, that's not being verbally clear. Staying on topic. It's easy to get distracted. It's easy to want to tell a narrative, particularly if it relates to the point of the class and it's entertaining. Answering questions efficiently and effectively. And that's sometimes a hard thing to balance because of the relational component of it. A yes-no question can be answered yes-no. But sometimes we know the student is not asking that, even though that's how the question was framed. Your pacing, and we know that sometimes takes us time to takes us time to settle in to a pace that works. All right, so the idea here is that, we need to be verbally clear. And I think that's the more difficult part because it's really relating to us talking. And as I've already mentioned, when you speak extemporaneously, we know that that's something, there's going to be some issues with that. In terms of being just structurally clear, and this is where the message design comes into play. Now, we all prepare differently, and we're all going, some people can speak right from their head. I'm always amazed at those teachers that have the points in their head and they can just go. Others of us, like myself, I write everything. I do follow, I have lecture notes. I always have my notes regardless of what I need them or something, because I put notes to myself in those notes. So when we talk about being structurally clear, this is something when you talk about message design, that if you want to make sure that you're going to be structurally clear, these are things you probably should do. And when I say should do, I mean you may want to have them written or highlighted in a particular way so that you know what you're doing. Now, again, if you teach from PowerPoint, which that's another debate, you can do this as well. And sometimes for some of us, that PowerPoint is really what keeps us structurally clear in the first place. All right, but here's some just good things I think we forget about doing. All right, so one is previewing the main ideas before we begin, which, we go in and we say, okay, today we're going to cover 3 topics. But then you also have to make sure that you review the points. And this one gets glossed over often because of time. You realize you look down at your clock, you realize you got 2 minutes and a lot more to say, and the preview goes out the window. All right, but still, if you can establish your pacing, you can still do this. Explicitly make the connection between point A and point B. Rather than cover point A and then move on to point B, explain. Provide some sort of transition statement, just like we would in a speech. Frequently stop to summarize ideas. You can ask students to, use a variety of different assessment techniques, like the 1-minute paper and things like that, if you're familiar with those, to help you with this. Stop the lecture and say, okay, everybody, write down the 3 main points we just covered, and then do a check-in with several of the students to see if that's what happened. Explain the objectives of each unit. Again, those learning outcomes. We may develop learning outcomes for the course. You need to get in the habit of developing learning outcomes for the day, along with the objectives that you might want to cover. Now, certainly these can tap into the outcomes of the course, but I find it very beneficial if I have these written down in my notes before I even start the day. Now, and I'll be honest, sometimes I articulate them to students and sometimes I don't, but I know what I'm doing, and I think that's even more important, because it then allows you to structure your content in the way that's going to work best. Use some sort of visual display. Now, again, some of us like to use different types of displays. PowerPoint, writing on the board. I'm a big board writer. I rarely ever use PowerPoint because I just didn't grow up using PowerPoint. I'm not a fan. But you can do different kinds of visual displays. You can have students actually engage and become the display, through activities and things like that. And then another way that Chesbrough mentions being structurally clear is by providing skeletal outlines of what you're going to talk about. And I know some people don't like this, and it depends on how you construct the skeletal outline, of course, too. I think some instructors feel this is like a giveaway, but it's not. These, when students can take good notes, and there have been a few research studies conducted by Scott Titsworth on this, that when students are able, let me rephrase my sentence, good note-taking is a function of instructor clarity. And, skeletal outlines, you're not giving anything away because you're doing other behaviors to keep them involved. What you're doing is allowing them to write down pivotal keywords or entire constructs or concepts. You're allowing them to write down within some sort of structured organization. I've used skeletal outlining with some of the large lecture classes I teach, and it really does help students stay on track. And it helps you stay on track as well. So it is something to consider. Don't look at it as being just an easy way. Let me back up. Don't look at it as being, you're not cheapening your student's education by doing this in any means. You're still teaching, you're still talking, you're still participating. All you're doing is organizing the information so that when they need to go back and look at it, they have it. All right? So that's something to consider. So with clarity, like I said, we have the Chesbrough article. I suggested that, or I included that for you to read so that you can just get a sense of what it means to be clear. Being clear is tough. We know that. Being clear takes time. I mean, how many times have you written an assignment only to realize as you're grading it that maybe you weren't clear with direction A, right, or output B? You have to employ all of this, across the board. Because again, when you do, the nice thing about all these rhetorical behaviors is that they all, again, are related to student learning, whether students, perceived learning or their actual learning that we measure in some sort of way. When we're clear, students learn. They think they learn at least. And they actually have greater affect for you as the instructor. And we find that pretty much with all the behaviors I'm talking about today and tomorrow. And that's one of the reasons why I chose these particular behaviors, because they work. Once you start using them, they will work. All right, the second behavior is called relevance. And this is a tougher one for us because we don't always know a whole lot about our students. And for a lot of us, what we know about students in general is just what we know about the generation itself, which sometimes is enough, sometimes isn't enough. Now, I would recommend that you do some things at the beginning of the semester to get to know your students, but that is a topic for another day. So let's just talk a little bit about what it means to be relevant. The article I suggested for reading today is written by Noster and myself. It was just recently published in Communication Studies. What we did, excuse me, is we replicated the Muddy Men and Freiermeyer 2009 study in terms of identifying the different ways in which instructors can become or can communicate relevance in the classroom. We defined or conceptualized relevance as those behaviors, again, that teachers intentionally use. So you'll see there's a theme here. It's all about intention, message creation. They intentionally use to tailor course content to their students' learning within a particular learning environment. So what you might use as relevance for your communication cornerstones class may not work in a public speaking class, all right? So, and this obviously goes with a lot of stuff we talk about, but relevance is really student driven. Excuse me. And so you have to have a sense of what's going to work for them. Now, if you have the article handy, there's 4 tables in the back that I'd like you to pull out, but if you don't have them, that's okay. You can go back and look at them because this is really the meat of the article. And here I have my dry erase board again. So basically, when we look at relevance for students is going to fall into 4 categories: what we call teaching style relevance, outside course relevance, inside course relevance, and then general methods and activities relevance. And these 4 categories were arrived at by Muddy and Freiermeyer. When Noster and I replicated the study, we found the same 4, but what we came up with was more contemporary examples of what falls under each of these. So I'm going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail, but excuse me, I'm going to have my trusty cough drop, which whenever I lecture, I tend to do this anyway, so it's not because I haven't talked to a lot of people because I've been stuck at home for the last 2 months. So in any case, the tables at the end provide examples of these types of categories of relevance behavior. So the first category was called teaching style. And teaching style relevance really centers on an instructor's personality or teaching style that makes students feel as if their personal needs and interests are being met or being addressed. So teaching style really has a lot to do with using a bunch of different instructional communication behaviors and then just general pedagogical behaviors as well, and also some interpersonal behaviors. So here are a few examples. I won't read the entire list because of time, but those who are teaching, so what this means is, according to students, when teachers engage in these behaviors make the content more relevant to them. And this is all about the teacher and how he or she communicates, this category. So clarity was actually the #1 most reported behavior here, which makes sense, all right? And I always tell people, if you're clear, chances are you're being relevant, because you're working at finding information that's going to be appealing to students. So clarity, humor, which we'll talk about in a second, popped up as a category. Immediacy, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Credibility, which is an impression from yesterday. So if you're credible, just by virtue of being credible, students believe that you can become relevant. Yeah, instructors present themselves as competent, trustworthy, and caring, as well as conducting themselves in a professional manner. And that's something to think about with credibility as well, which I did not mention yesterday, right? Being professional, whatever that term means, but you know it. There's some interpersonal behaviors, like being congenial, being enthusiastic, being considerate. So, bottom line here for category 1, teaching style, a lot of what you do in terms of your comm behaviors, whether they're instructional, pedagogical, or interpersonal, students attach that to relevance. So again, another reason why this is so key. The second category was called outside course relevance. All right, so there we go. And this basically was when, and this is where I think sometimes we have problems as instructors, is where you're trying to make a parallel between the course material and students' interests, needs, goals outside the classroom. So, for example, popular culture, bringing those examples into class. And I will tell you, this is one I struggle with, because I just am not up on popular culture like my students are. I had a group of students a few years ago, 2 years ago, we were doing a project, and they were going to use popular culture figures to draw students into their activity. And so they decided on Beyonce, DJ Khaled, and Post Malone. Now some of you was like, oh, I know all 3 of those. So you're like, oh, I know Beyonce, right? Because she's been around a while. I didn't know who that Post Malone was. And I even tested them and said, I don't know about these 3. They're like, well, Dr. Myers, just because you don't know them. I'm like, okay, I get that, fine. Yeah, they were right. Those were every student who stopped by their activity booth knew who the 3 were, and the activity went just fine, blah, blah, blah. So the point is, that's one that's hard for me, because the TV shows I watch, they don't watch. Actually, my students say they don't watch TV. All right, so another example would be current life and interest. That might be easier to do because college students have similar interests regardless of how long we've been teaching. Current events, depends on how on whether we're all paying attention to what goes on, outside class. So that's our second category, outside course relevance, bringing in things from outside the classroom, all right, to meet the students' interests, goals, and needs. The third one was called, and I got my thingy again, inside course, right? Inside course relevance, which we found in this study that this was the most frequently used category. Our participants perceived their teachers use this one the most, and they rated it the most effective. The inside course relevance are strategies that use inside the course. They're perceived as relevant. And these really are the pedagogical things that we've learned to do over time or that we're still learning. Some of them also would fall under the clarity umbrella too. So for example, being organized. That's seen as relevance to students. Accessibility, making the course content available to students. That's relevant. Reminding students about deadlines, reminders to students. Being told when something's due and being reminded the day before, that is relevant to them. And then again, there's some others as well. And then the last category is called methods and activities relevance. And these are just in-class things you can do. And this really falls into some of that learning management role function that we talked about on Monday. Discussion, using visual aids, in-class activities, group work, field trips, applications. That would be like real-world assignments, something like that. All right, so when it comes to relevance, like I said, these are 4 categories of how teachers can do this. All right, we can use teaching style, outside course, inside course, methods, and activities. What we found in this particular study was that inside course was the most frequent and the most effective. And then that was followed by teaching style. So if you really, again, we're talking about rhetorical messages, in order to be intentional in terms of our creation, think about what you can do to be relevant, especially with your inside course, right? Those are things you can do, and that don't take a whole lot of time, but do make sense. Another takeaway from the study is that you don't have to worry as much about the outside course, because if students aren't keeping up on current events, or you don't know what they're watching or going to the movies, or what video games they're playing, or what music they're listening to, it's not going to work, all right? So focus also then on the teaching style. Think about your communication behaviors. Think about some of your interpersonal behaviors, your relational behaviors, self-disclosure, fairness. Those are 2 I didn't mention earlier. Personalizing assignments, which we don't necessarily think about as being relevant. But hey, instead of giving an exam, maybe give students 3 options for how they could complete the exam. That's one way of making course relevant. I had a class in grad school, actually, where I had to write a fable as my final exam. And I'll tell you, I had the best time writing that little, I had a good time writing the fable. I mean, I really did, because I like to be a little creative, and I like to think outside the box. And at the time, I wasn't as pleased, but wow, what a way to make the course content relevant, rather than just an exam, personalizing it and letting people do what they need to do. All right, so that's relevance again, where you're intentionally tailoring the course content to meet the student's needs within a particular learning environment. All right, so far, and again, here we go, running out of time as usual, right? So clarity is our first behavior, which, we've already discussed that. Clarity is all about student understanding and retention. Then we just talked a little bit about relevance, which is really about tailoring the course content to the student learning. And then we're going to talk just briefly about humor. And humor is a tricky one for some of us because we're not funny, right? And one thing I do want to say about all these behaviors, well, because you need to be clear. I mean, that's one you really do need to work on. But if you don't think you can do some of this well, then don't do it. Or do it in small amounts and incrementally build up. All right. So humor is not always the most necessary behavior, but I can tell you just from practical experience that students appreciate it. Now, it's a little tricky also compared to and this is the other thing too. Students can agree that you're clear, right? They can agree if you're relevant. They don't always agree if you're funny. Humor is tricky because there's so much subjectivity that goes into it, right? And if you look at the humor research over the years, you'll find that the form itself has changed. Brian Kaminsky and Zillman did a study in 1979, yeah, where they asked students to identify the behaviors, the humorous attempts, right? They actually had students audio tape the lecture and they pulled them out. And in 79, apparently, jokes, riddles, puns, and funny stories were really how instructors engaged in humor. Now, fast forward many years later, there's probably not a whole lot of us that use riddles or puns. Okay, so that's one issue right there. What form does the humor take? Another big issue is the humor offensive or does it make fun of somebody? Now, one of the articles we're reading for today is by Melissa Wanzer and her colleagues, and where they identified appropriate and inappropriate types of humor. Students provide these examples. And, they found, appropriate humor included anything related to the class. It also included a lot of things unrelated. It involved unintentional humor, because we've all engaged in that, and then also self-disparaging humor. So the teacher, if I make fun of myself for something that I'm doing, that's viewed by students as appropriate. Humor becomes inappropriate when it's offensive, and offensive really can depend on the student. We know that from our personal lives. The types of humor we use with our families and friends, the appropriate level can definitely vary. And then for students also, when humor disparaged a student or students or disparaged others, they found that is inappropriate also. So if the teacher, if you want to make fun of yourself, that can be viewed as appropriate humor. Make fun of a student or a group of students, not so. And that is a tricky one too, because sometimes you do that and you don't have any ill will, but that's just how it's viewed. So again, humor we consider to be another intentional behavior. You have to think about your humor use before you engage in it in the classroom. And you really have to put a lot more energy into this one because of the different ways in which it can be conveyed. And so we define humor, conceptualize humor, as, again, verbal and nonverbal messages that instructors use to intentionally make learning enjoyable, pleasurable, or delightful. We want students to laugh. We want students to find some level of enjoyment in the humor, but we have to be careful about the types of humor that we use. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention as we begin to wrap up with humor is that there's a recent study done by McKay West and Matt Martin. It's published in 2019 in ComEd. I have it listed as one of our readings, where they examined the notion of humor homophily. And I thought this was pretty interesting. Remember we talked about homophily yesterday with impressions? Well, students who believe that they possess the same type of humor homophily as their instructors, they rate their instructors as funnier. They rate those humorous attempts as more appropriate. They have more affect for the class, and they also have greater motivation. So, I mean, that might be really something to consider when you intentionally look at your humor. How similar do your students view you in terms of humor usage? You can always find, if you're a sarcastic person, you can always find someone in the class who finds you sarcastic, who laughs at what you say, right? But not everybody does. Telling dad jokes. I have a TA who starts off her classes with a dad joke, and it's done unintentionally, and everybody laughs because they understand the purpose behind it. But again, that's the key right there. It's intentional. She does that on purpose. They know it is part of her message design, so it works. Otherwise, it probably would not. Okay. So as we finish for today, we talked about teaching from the rhetorical perspective. We discussed clarity, relevance, and humor. And so, what I'd like for you to do overnight is just think about how you engage in these behaviors. If you can engage in these behaviors, what can you do to improve these behaviors? These behaviors work. These behaviors are effective. These behaviors are going to have a significant effect on your student participation and their classroom engagement and their learning in the course. All right, so we'll stop for today, and I will see you tomorrow.